I will never forget the night when everything inside me broke and something far more dangerous was born. The air outside the Charleston Place Hotel carried the sweet smell of magnolia and expensive perfume as my family gathered under glittering chandeliers for yet another charity gala designed to polish our public image. I had walked through those glass doors believing I was finally strong enough to stand tall against them, but I was wrong. Within minutes, my own blood would stain the marble floor. My screams would echo through the ballroom, and dozens of strangers would lift their phones to capture the nightmare that my family unleashed on me. It did not happen in some dark corner hidden away. No, it happened in front of everyone. My father's hand came first, the sting sharp across my face as the crowd gasped. My brother's shove knocked the breath out of me as my body struck the polished floor. My mother's fingers clawed at my hair as though tearing away my very dignity. They circled me like predators, their rage boiling over $2 million that my grandmother had left me in her will. Money they insisted belonged to the company and not to me. I heard glasses shatter. I heard someone shouting to stop, but no one dared step forward. I was humiliated, battered, and left lying on the ground under the glow of 1,000 watchful eyes. I remember the cold stone pressing against my cheek, the copper taste in my mouth, and the crushing weight of betrayal heavier than any bruise. That was the night they thought they had silenced me. That was the night they believed pain would force me to surrender. But they did not know me. They did not understand that by trying to destroy me in public, they had given me an audience. And one day soon, that same audience would witness the collapse of everything they had built. My name is Natalie Crawford, and I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a family where appearances meant everything and love was measured in obedience. From the outside, we looked like a dynasty of success. The Crawford Construction Group had its name on highways, schools, and bridges across the state. My father, Victor Crawford, wore his title of CEO like armor striding into boardrooms with the same authority he used at our dinner table. My mother, Elaine, kept up the facade of Southern grace her pearls and pressed suits masking the chill in her voice whenever I dared to speak against them. And then there was my brother Thomas, 4 years older than me, and raised to inherit the empire groomed to believe that power was his birthright. Growing up, I felt like an accessory rather than a daughter. Our home in the historic district of Charleston was filled with oil paintings, antique furniture, and silence so heavy that even laughter felt like rebellion. My father expected perfection, my mother expected compliance, and Thomas expected me to stay out of the way. I learned early that standing up for myself came with punishment. Every time I questioned a decision or asked why our workers were underpaid while we hosted lavish galas, my father's temper flared. Every time I wanted to choose my own path instead of following the company line, my mother reminded me that family unity mattered more than truth. By the time I turned 18, I was suffocating. I left Charleston for Savannah, Georgia, just 2 hours away, but a world apart. There, I studied finance and carved out a life on my own. I rented a small apartment near Forsyth Park, worked long hours at a local investment firm, and learned to breathe without feeling watched. I built friendships that felt real free from the constant judgment of my family name. For the first time, I believed I could choose who I wanted to be. But no matter how far I ran, the Crawford name was a shadow that followed me. At every holiday, every wedding, every funeral, the same dynamics reappeared. My father reminding me of duty. My mother criticizing my independence, my brother dismissing me as a dreamer who didn't understand real business. I endured it quietly because part of me hoped that one day they would see me as more than the girl who walked away. That hope shattered the day my grandmother died. She was the only member of the Crawford family who treated me with tenderness. Her hands were worn from years of volunteering, her smile genuine in a way I rarely saw at home. She would slip me cookies in the kitchen when I was scolded, whisper that I was stronger than I knew. When I left for Savannah, she was the one who hugged me longest, pressing an old silver locket into my palm. Her passing was expected, but the loss felt like a piece of my safe world had vanished. I returned to Charleston for the reading of her will held in a law office downtown near Broad Street. I sat between men in suits and women in polished heels, my family lined up like statues carved from pride. When the lawyer adjusted his glasses and announced that my grandmother had left me $2 million in cash and assets directly bypassing the company, the air in the room seemed to shatter. Victor's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Elaine's hand clutched her pearls as if someone had insulted her honor. Thomas leaned forward, his face red, spitting out the words, "That money belongs to the company, not you." The room went still, and I felt every gaze shift toward me. My heart pounded, but I held my ground. I did not speak, only lifted my chin and met their stares with the quiet defiance that had carried me out of their house years ago. They thought my silence was weakness. They did not know it was resolve. The silence that followed the reading of the will was not the kind that faded with time. It was the kind that hardened into resentment, filling every corner of the room like smoke. I watched my father's fingers drum against the polished oak table, a rhythm of suppressed fury. My mother leaned close to him, whispering, though her eyes never left me. And Thomas, my brother, wore a smile that was anything but amused. It was the look of a man already plotting. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to continue with the rest of the estate, but no one was listening. Victor finally broke the tension, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut glass. "Natalie, you know this money was never meant to divide the family. It belongs where it can grow the legacy. You will transfer it to the company, of course." His tone left no room for argument. It was the same tone he used when ordering contractors or reprimanding employees. But this time, I was not a worker on his payroll. I was his daughter, and I had been given a gift by the only person in our family who had ever seen me. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice not to tremble. Grandma left it to me. She made her choice. My words were simple, but they landed like a stone, dropped into still water. My mother gasped softly as if I had cursed in church. Thomas laughed short and bitter. "You don't even know what to do with that kind of money. You'll waste it on your little projects in Savannah. That money is Crawford money, and Crawford money stays with Crawford men." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sensing the storm that was gathering, but he was powerless to stop it. My father's eyes locked on mine, cold and unblinking. "Think carefully, Natalie. Family comes before everything. If you defy us, you will regret it." His words were not a warning. They were a sentence. I left the office that day with the weight of their stares burning into my back. Outside, Charleston's historic streets bustled with tourists, carriages clattering over cobblestones, musicians playing by the market. To anyone passing by, it was a beautiful southern afternoon. But to me, it felt like the air itself was pressing down heavy with what was to come. Back in Savannah, I tried to focus on work, on friends, on anything that would keep me steady. Yet I knew the Crawfords were not a family that forgave or forgot. They were a dynasty obsessed with control, and I had just become the crack in their foundation. I replayed my father's words over and over. "If you defy us, you will regret it." I knew they would not confront me quietly. For the Crawfords, everything was a performance, and humiliation was their favorite weapon. Weeks later, the invitation arrived, an embossed card for a grand fundraising gala hosted by Crawford Construction at the Charleston Place Hotel. I almost didn't go. Every instinct told me it was a trap. But a louder voice inside whispered that if I stayed away, they would win before the fight had even begun. So I put on a navy dress, the locket my grandmother had given me, and I walked back into their world, determined to hold my ground. What I did not know that evening, as I stepped into the glow of chandeliers and polite applause, was that my family had already decided the stage for my public breaking. They believed fear would bend me. They believed shame would silence me. They believed pain would strip away my resolve. They were wrong. The ballroom at the Charleston Place Hotel glittered with the kind of wealth only old families could wield. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across polished marble floors, and waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne through the crowd. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music a delicate curtain over whispered conversations. To every guest, it looked like a perfect evening of charity and Southern refinement. To me, it was the stage where my family would test the limits of my dignity. I arrived alone, my heels clicking across the floor as eyes followed me. Some guests nodded politely, but many simply stared. They had heard whispers already, that Natalie Crawford had been singled out in the will, that she had refused to turn the money over, that she was foolish enough to stand apart from the empire her father had built. Rumors spread quickly in Charleston's social circles, and tonight they all seemed to have found their way into this room. At the center of it all stood Victor Crawford, my father towering in his tailored black suit, the weight of his presence commanding attention. My mother, Elaine, was by his side in a gown of deep emerald, her pearls catching the light. And Thomas, my brother, laughed too loudly with a group of contractors near the bar, his drink sloshing dangerously close to the rim. I forced my breathing to stay calm as I moved closer. I had rehearsed my lines in the mirror, telling myself over and over that I would not bend. I would smile, I would hold my head high, and I would not give them the satisfaction of fear. Victor saw me first. His smile was practiced thin, the kind that never touched the eyes. He spread his arms wide as if welcoming me, but his voice carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Natalie, you finally decided to join the family. We were beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten where you came from." Guests nearby chuckled politely, unsure whether it was meant as a joke. My cheeks burned, but I steadied myself. "I never forget where I come from," I said, my tone even. "But I also don't forget where I'm going." For a moment, silence. Then Thomas stepped in, his smirk as cruel as I remembered. "Where you're going, little sister, is straight to the bank to sign over that inheritance. You can't keep $2 million locked away while the company bleeds. Be reasonable." The words were bait spoken loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. A few heads turned. I felt the walls closing in. My father's hand gripped my shoulder with deceptive gentleness, his voice a low growl. "This is not the place for defiance. There is paperwork waiting. You will sign it tonight in front of your family, in front of Charleston." I pulled back, my pulse racing. "No," I said. "Clear. Firm." My voice echoed louder than I intended, cutting through the music. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victor's eyes darkened. Thomas's smirk widened. Elaine lifted her chin, her lips pressed into a thin line. Around us, phones discreetly lifted their cameras, blinking red. The performance had begun, and I was no longer just Natalie Crawford. I was a spectacle. The moment the word "no" left my mouth, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The quartet faltered, one violin string squeaking before silence swallowed the music whole. For a heartbeat, all I could hear was the thunder of my own pulse in my ears. Then, like a storm breaking, my father's hand snapped across my face. The sound cracked through the air louder than the chandelier's crystal clinking. Gasps erupted, and someone dropped a glass that shattered against the marble floor. I staggered back, clutching my cheek, but before I could steady myself, Thomas lunged forward. His hands shoved hard into my shoulders, slamming me against the banquet table. Plates rattled, champagne spilled, and my body jolted with pain. Elaine's voice cut through the chaos, not with concern, but with venom. "Sign the papers, Natalie. End this nonsense before you destroy us all." The crowd pressed closer, some with phones, raised high, recording every second. I could see red blinking lights out of the corners of my eyes. A woman near the front whispered, horrified, "Oh my God, they're actually hitting her!" I tried to push myself upright, my breath ragged, but Thomas gripped my arm and yanked me down. "You're nothing without this family," he hissed, his face twisted with rage. My ribs screamed from the impact, and I bit back a cry. My father loomed above me, his voice booming over the stunned crowd. "If you defy us, you're no daughter of mine. You're just another obstacle. And obstacles get crushed." The words, cold and merciless, struck deeper than the blows. My mother, elegant in her pearls, reached down not to help me, but to claw the locket from around my neck. The chain snapped, the one gift my grandmother had left me besides the money, and she held it up as if claiming a trophy. Her expression was pure triumph, her voice cutting. "You don't deserve even this." The pressure in my chest built until it felt like the walls of the ballroom were collapsing inward. My legs trembled, my body weakening from the strikes, but my spirit, though buried under humiliation, refused to die. I forced my eyes up to meet theirs, my voice hoarse but defiant. "You can beat me in front of them all, but you'll never own me again." The guests erupted in panicked chatter. Some shouted for security, others pleaded for someone to intervene, but the Crawfords were too powerful, too untouchable in this city. Victor raised his hand again, ready to strike, when finally a hotel staff member shoved through the crowd and shouted for help. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Within moments, paramedics pushed their way inside. My body gave way at last, collapsing to the cold marble floor. Blood trickled warm from my lip, staining the hem of my dress. I heard the shrill cries of onlookers, the click of cameras, the rush of gurney wheels. Then darkness closed in heavy and absolute. As they lifted me, one thought burned bright against the blackness they believed this night would silence me forever. But this night, this spectacle of cruelty, would be the beginning of their downfall. I woke to the sterile sting of antiseptic and the low, rhythmic beep of a monitor beside me. My eyes fluttered open against the harsh fluorescent light, and for a moment I could not remember where I was. Then the pain hit sharp and merciless. My ribs burned with every shallow breath, and a dull ache pounded at the back of my skull. Slowly the pieces returned the chandeliers, the crowd, my father's hand, my brothers shoved the marble floor rushing up to meet me. A nurse hovered nearby, her face tense. She adjusted the IV line taped to my arm and glanced quickly toward the door as if afraid of being overheard. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "You're at MUSC. You had broken ribs, a concussion. You were brought in last night." She hesitated, biting her lip, then added, "They told us to write it up as an accident, a fall down the stairs." I blinked at her, stunned. "A fall?" The words rasped out of my dry throat. She nodded quickly, eyes darting toward the hallway. "Your family has influence. They insisted. I shouldn't even be telling you this." Her voice trembled, and I understood she was risking something just by warning me. Before I could ask more, the door opened. My mother swept in pearls at her throat, gleaming under the hospital light. She moved as if she were visiting a social acquaintance, not a daughter lying broken in bed. "Natalie," she said coolly, "you've caused enough embarrassment. The press already has their version. You slipped. Do not contradict it." My hands clenched the sheet. "That's not what happened. Everyone saw." Her eyes narrowed, sharp as glass. "Everyone saw what we tell them they saw. This city owes us everything. Do not mistake pity for power." With that, she placed a bouquet of lilies on the side table, her mask of gentility firmly in place, and left as quickly as she had entered. Moments later, my father appeared, his broad frame filling the doorway. His gaze swept over me, not with concern, but calculation. "This ends now," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but each syllable carried weight. "You will sign the transfer. You will tell anyone who asks that you tripped. You will not shame us further." I forced my aching body to sit up a little, pain searing through my side. "You broke me in front of Charleston. You think silence will save you now?" His eyes flashed just for a second with the threat of violence contained. Then he leaned closer, his breath hot against my ear. "We built this city, Natalie, and we can erase you from it." When he finally left, the nurse returned, her face pale. She slipped a folded piece of paper into my palm. "This is the original intake note," she whispered, "before they changed it. It says what really happened. Hide it. You may need it." I stared down at the single page, trembling my blood, staining the corner where my hand pressed. It was proof. Fragile, dangerous proof. The hours blurred together in that hospital room, the steady beeping of machines counting time like a cruel metronome. Pain held me captive, but it was the silence after each visit from my family that cut deeper than any injury. They never came to check if I was healing. They came to ensure my obedience. Elaine with her icy reminders of reputation. Victor with his threats wrapped in civility. Thomas didn't bother with pretense. He simply leaned over me once, a smug grin plastered across his face, and whispered, "You should have signed when you had the chance." That night alone, with the dim light casting long shadows across the linoleum floor, I held the nurse's folded note in my hands. The original record. My truth. proof that I had been brought in as a victim of assault, not as some clumsy woman who stumbled down a staircase. My heart pounded as I traced the ink with my fingertips. I understood then that I was living in a war for evidence, not just survival. My family had wealth connections and the loyalty of half the city's institutions. All I had was a piece of paper, a trembling nurse's courage, and the fire beginning to stir inside me. The next morning, a reporter from the Post and Courier appeared at the nurse's station, but he never made it to my room. Through the cracked door, I saw Thomas intercept him, his hand gripping the man's arm, his words too low to hear, but sharp enough to send the reporter retreating down the hall. I realized in that moment how far the Crawfords' reach extended. If I stayed silent, my story would vanish. If I spoke, they would crush me again. Either way, they believed they had already won. But as I lay there bruised and aching, I remembered my grandmother's final hug, the locket torn from my neck, the choice she had made to leave her legacy with me. She had seen something in me that the rest of them refused to acknowledge. I would not dishonor her by surrendering now. 3 days later, the doctors cleared me for discharge. My ribs were wrapped tight, pain shot through me with every step, but I walked out of MUSC with that hidden page pressed flat against my skin. Outside, Charleston's humid air wrapped around me like a challenge. My family's black sedan idled at the curb, a driver waiting. I ignored it and called a cab instead. I would not let them control even the way I left the hospital. As the cab pulled away, I glanced back once. Through the tinted window of the sedan, I saw my father watching me. His expression unreadable, but his presence unmistakable. He lifted a phone to his ear as we turned the corner. They believed they had caged me with fear. What they did not know was that fear was already turning into resolve. Every bruise, every scar, every lie recorded in those hospital files was fuel. They had wanted to erase me, but all they had done was give me a reason to fight. Savannah had always felt like a sanctuary, but when I returned after the hospital, even the oak trees draped in Spanish moss seemed to whisper warnings. I carried the folded intake note like a relic, hiding it in the lining of my purse. Every bruise on my body throbbed in time with the question echoing in my mind. Who could I trust against the Crawfords? Their reach stretched from Charleston City Hall to the boardrooms of Columbia. I needed someone beyond their grasp. That was when I remembered Marcus Hayes. I had met him briefly during a finance conference in Atlanta years earlier. He was younger than most of the lawyers in the room, sharp-eyed, outspoken, and unafraid to call out corruption even when it made the crowd bristle. I remembered his voice, measured but fiery, as he argued that wealth and power in the South had been used too long as shields against justice. That voice had stayed with me. It took only one call to his office before his assistant arranged a meeting. 2 days later, I sat across from Marcus in a modest office above a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta, far from the gleaming skyscrapers of the city's corporate firms. He listened as I laid out everything, the will, the gala, the assault, the hospital cover-up. When I finished, he leaned back, arms crossed, his brow furrowed in thought. "You realize what you're asking," he said at last. "To go against the Crawfords in Charleston is to go against a dynasty. They have judges in their pockets, police chiefs on their Christmas card lists. This isn't just a legal battle, it's war." I met his gaze steady despite the tremor in my ribs. They wanted to break me in public. I won't let them succeed. I need someone who believes the law can still stand taller than their money. His expression softened just slightly, and then he nodded. "Then we start with evidence. You've got that intake note. That's gold, but it's only the beginning. We'll need witnesses video, anything we can put in front of a judge, and you'll need someone to tell your story beyond the courtroom." That was when Janelle Carter entered the picture. Janelle and I had been inseparable during our years at the University of Georgia, sneaking out for midnight coffees, sharing dreams about careers and freedom. Where I had chosen finance, she had chosen journalism, chasing truth with the same relentless drive she once used to ace every exam. When I called her and told her what had happened, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then her voice low and fierce. "Nat, they don't get to bury this. You give me names, dates, faces, and I'll give you headlines. But understand, once we start, there's no turning back." We met in a quiet cafe near Forsyth Park, far from Charleston's watchful eyes. The ceiling fans turned lazily overhead, stirring the humid Georgia air as Marcus spread his files across the table. Janelle slid in beside me, a notepad already open, her pen tapping in restless rhythm. Between us lay the fragile scrap of truth, the original intake note from the hospital. Marcus picked it up carefully, scanning it as though it were a piece of rare evidence in a criminal trial. "This proves you didn't fall," he said, "but it won't be enough on its own. The Crawfords will call it a clerical error. We need more. Video from the gala, eyewitness statements, anyone willing to say they saw what really happened." Janelle leaned forward, her eyes sharp with determination. "I've already reached out to a few people who were at the fundraiser. Some of them are whispering online about what they saw. No one wants to be the first to speak publicly, but if we show them their strength in numbers, they might come forward." I nodded, my pulse quickening. Guests had their phones out. I saw the lights. There has to be footage. Marcus scribbled notes, his jaw tight. "Then we track it down." "Janelle, you dig through social media, talk to anyone who was there." "Natalie, you need to rest, but you also need to remember every detail, who stood where, who shouted what. Sometimes the smallest memory becomes the key that cracks a lie." For hours, we pieced together a plan. Marcus outlined the legal steps, filing a civil suit for assault, petitioning for an independent review of the hospital's records, preparing subpoenas for security footage. Janelle mapped out the media strategy, how to release pieces of the story in waves, each one building pressure, forcing the Crawfords into a corner. I listened, adding fragments from my memory. The woman in the red dress who cried out when Victor struck me, the waiter whose tray crashed when Thomas shoved me, the hotel staffer who called for an ambulance. Each detail became a thread in the net we were weaving. When the meeting ended, the sun was sliding low, casting long shadows across the park. Marcus gathered the papers, his expression resolute. "This won't be quick. They'll fight with everything they have, money lawyers' threats. But if we stand together, we can outlast them." Janelle slipped her arm through mine as we walked out. "Nat, you're not alone anymore. They wanted to isolate you to make you think you had no one. That ends today." For the first time since the gala, I felt a flicker of strength return. I was bruised, still aching, but no longer cornered. My family had tried to turn a public beating into my downfall. With Marcus and Janelle beside me, it would become the first step in their unraveling. The first strike came quicker than I expected. Within a week of Marcus filing the preliminary complaint, the Crawfords held a press conference on the steps of Charleston's City Hall. I watched the live feed from my apartment in Savannah, my hands trembling as I clutched the remote. There they stood, my father towering in his dark suit, my mother draped in pearls and feigned grief, and Thomas practically sneering at the cameras. Elaine spoke first, her voice quivering just enough to sound sincere. "Our daughter has been struggling with personal issues for some time. What happened at the gala was tragic, but it was not what she claims. She suffered an episode. She fell. And now she has been misled into attacking her own family." Victor stepped forward next, his voice steady, commanding. "The Crawfords have built this city. We employ thousands, donate millions, and will not be slandered by false accusations. My daughter is unwell. I ask the public for prayers, not judgment." Thomas closed it out with a performance that made bile rise in my throat. "She's always been dramatic. This is just another tantrum. We love her, but we cannot let her destroy our company." The crowd of reporters shouted questions, but the narrative had been set. That evening, headlines painted me as unstable, troubled, even dangerous. Social media split in two, some calling for justice, others calling me ungrateful and greedy. I felt the walls closing in again until Janelle stormed into my apartment, laptop under her arm. "They want to play public opinion." "Fine. Let's give the people something real." She pulled up grainy footage from a guest's phone. The video wasn't perfect, but it was damning. It showed Victor's arm swing, the sharp crack of contact, my body reeling backward. The audio caught Elaine's voice, shrill and unmistakable. "Sign the papers, Natalie." We uploaded it to every platform Janelle could reach. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended, #justice for Natalie Crawford cover-up. Strangers messaged me, sharing their own stories of families who valued money over love. The tide had begun to turn, but Marcus warned it would not last. "Their lawyers will say the video is doctored," he cautioned. "We need corroboration." Witnesses. More than one clip. So, we dug deeper. Marcus subpoenaed the hotel's security cameras, though we both knew the Crawfords would fight to suppress them. Janelle tracked down guests one by one, some too afraid to speak, others willing to share what they saw as long as their names were kept private. Slowly, we were building a wall of truth brick by brick. The Crawfords answered with their own barrage. Anonymous articles appeared online claiming I had a history of drug use, that I had been fired from jobs for erratic behavior. Old photos from college were twisted into scandal. Even friends I trusted began receiving calls, thinly veiled threats warning them to stay away from me. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling fan, the noise of cicadas buzzing outside my window. Doubt clawed at me, whispering that maybe they were too powerful, maybe no one could win against them. But then I would open my phone and see the messages from strangers: keep fighting. You're not alone. Each one was a reminder. The Crawfords had their empire. I had the truth. Marcus's office became our war room. Files stacked high on his desk, sticky notes covered the walls, and a corkboard displayed names of witnesses with strings connecting them to the timeline of that night. Every hour brought a new challenge, a new smear campaign launched by the Crawfords, but every hour also brought us closer to the cracks in their armor. One breakthrough came when Janelle tracked down a hotel waiter named Luis, who had been serving champagne near the stage. He remembered the crash of his tray when Thomas shoved me, and he had seen everything. Fear kept him silent at first, but Janelle persuaded him with a simple truth. If they can do this to Natalie in front of Charleston, what do you think they can do to anyone else? Shaking Luis finally agreed to give a sworn statement. Marcus's eyes lit up when he read it. This changes things. With Luis, the video, and the intake note, we have a chain of evidence. They can't claim it was all fabricated. At the same time, pressure mounted in ways we hadn't expected. Workers from Crawford Construction began reaching out anonymously, telling stories of unpaid overtime, safety corners cut on projects, intimidation when they spoke up. Marcus sorted through them carefully, but a pattern emerged. Victor and Thomas had not only abused me, they had been exploiting their entire workforce. We can expand this, Marcus said, tapping his pen against the table. It's not just your assault anymore, it's systemic corruption. If we frame this as a public battle between truth and power, people will rally. And they did. The hashtag movement swelled, amplified by stories from employees who had been silenced for years. A group of contractors in Columbia released a joint letter condemning the Crawfords' business practices. Former partners in Greenville broke contracts citing ethical concerns. For the first time, the dynasty that had seemed untouchable was wobbling. The Crawfords struck back harder. I received threatening voicemails, anonymous numbers hissing promises that I would regret dragging the family through the mud. Marcus advised me to save every message. Each threat is another nail in their coffin, he said grimly. Despite the fear, I began to sense a shift. At church on Sunday, an older woman approached me quietly, pressing my hand. I knew your grandmother, she whispered. She'd be proud. Don't let them scare you. Her words carried more weight than she could know. By the time we filed the official lawsuit, assault, conspiracy to falsify medical records, corporate fraud, the Crawfords were already reeling. They hired the best attorneys in South Carolina, men in $1,000 suits who swaggered into courtrooms with the confidence of victory. But for every dollar they spent, Marcus countered with precision. For every lie they fed to the press, Janelle answered with another piece of truth. The war with my family was no longer just mine. It was a fight the city had begun to claim as its own. And as I stood in Marcus's office one evening, watching Janelle pin another headline to the board, I realized something. They had wanted me erased. Instead, they had made me the face of their unraveling. The morning of the hearing at Charleston City Hall broke heavy with summer heat. Crowds gathered on the wide stone steps, a sea of signs and voices rising in defiance of the dynasty that had once ruled the city unquestioned. Reporters swarmed their cameras trained on the grand entrance where the Crawfords were expected to arrive. Some held microphones out to the chanting crowd, capturing the wave of outrage that had built for weeks. Justice for Natalie, they shouted, voices echoing off the historic buildings, filling the air with something I had not felt in a long time: hope. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The chamber was packed, every seat filled with citizens, workers, and members of the press. At the front sat the city officials and legal panel prepared to hear testimony and review evidence. To one side, Victor Elaine and Thomas Crawford entered with their attorneys, their polished appearances unable to mask the tension etched into their faces. Across the aisle, Marcus sat beside me, his calm presence grounding me. Janelle was just behind us, her notepad ready, a live stream already broadcasting to thousands watching from home. When my name was called, I rose slowly, my ribs still tender, but my steps steady. The room hushed. I could feel every eye on me as I walked to the podium. For a moment, the memory of the gala flooded back, the sting of my father's hand, the jeers of my brother, the shame of being struck down under chandeliers. My knees threatened to buckle, but I tightened my grip on the podium and let the anger steady me. "My name is Natalie Crawford," I began, my voice carrying further than I expected. "I stand here today, not just as their daughter and sister, but as a survivor of what they tried to erase. On the night of the gala, my family attacked me in front of hundreds of witnesses because I refused to surrender the inheritance my grandmother left me. They wanted to silence me, to make me a cautionary tale. But I refused to disappear." Gasps rippled through the crowd. I pulled the intake note from my folder, holding it up. This is the original hospital record before it was altered under their influence. It states what really happened, injuries consistent with an assault. They forced the staff to rewrite it to cover their shame with lies. Across the room, Thomas shifted in his chair, whispering urgently to his attorney. Victor sat rigid, jaw clenched, his gaze locked on me with pure venom. Elaine's eyes darted nervously, scanning the crowd. Marcus rose next, his voice measured, deliberate. He laid out the evidence like a craftsman assembling a case brick by brick. The video clip of my father's strike, the sworn testimony of Luis, the waiter, statements from employees describing intimidation and corruption. The chamber buzzed with each revelation. The narrative the Crawfords had spun, unraveling thread by thread. When the panel asked for response, Thomas could no longer contain himself. He shot to his feet, voice cracking with fury. "She deserved it. She was tearing the family apart." The words hung in the air, heavy and damning. Gasps erupted, cameras clicked, and whispers surged through the room. For the first time, I saw the mask slip from my brother's face, and the crowd saw it too. The chamber erupted after Thomas's outburst. Reporters scrambled to capture every angle, their cameras flashing as his words ricocheted across the hall. The panelists exchanged sharp glances, whispering among themselves, the weight of his confession settling like a stone dropped into still water. The room no longer saw a polished Southern family. They saw what I had always known: rage, entitlement, and rot hiding behind expensive suits. Marcus wasted no time. He leaned forward, his voice calm, but edged with steel. "You heard it from his own mouth. They believe violence is justified when their power is challenged. That is not family. That is tyranny." One of the panelists asked if we had further evidence. Marcus nodded. "Yes, Your Honors. We have uncovered financial records showing Crawford Construction funneled company funds into shell accounts tied to a bridge project in Mount Pleasant. Millions of taxpayer dollars were diverted under Victor and Thomas Crawford's supervision." The room gasped again. Janelle's live stream exploded with comments, the scrolling feed on her screen a blur of outrage and disbelief. Contractors in the audience shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads, others glaring at the Crawfords with fresh anger. A clerk wheeled in boxes of documents, copies of invoices, wire transfers, and signed approvals. Marcus laid them out in sequence, each one hammering another nail into the coffin of their reputation. "This is not just a family matter. This is corporate fraud and betrayal of public trust." Victor finally rose, his composure cracking. His voice thundered across the chamber. "You think you can destroy me with paperwork and petty accusations? I built this city. Without me, you would have no bridges, no schools, no homes." But his words no longer carried reverence. The crowd booed, voices rising like a tide. "Justice for Natalie," they shouted. "Shut it down." Elaine reached for his arm, her face pale, her mask of grace slipping into panic. "Victor, sit down," she hissed, but the microphones caught it, amplifying her desperation for everyone to hear. Then came the final blow. Luis, the waiter, stepped nervously to the podium, his hands shaking but his voice clear. "I saw it all. I saw Mr. Crawford strike her. I saw Thomas shove her. I heard Mrs. Crawford demand she sign papers. It wasn't a fall. It was an attack. Silence followed his words, heavy and absolute. For a moment, even the Crawfords had no reply. The truth stood naked, undeniable, in the center of the room. The panel chair cleared his throat, his voice steady. Effective immediately, we are suspending all city contracts with Crawford Construction pending investigation. Furthermore, this matter will be referred for criminal prosecution. The Crawfords froze. Victor's face drained of color, Thomas slammed a fist against the table, and Elaine buried her face in her hands. The dynasty that had ruled Charleston for decades crumbled before the eyes of its people. As the chamber erupted into cheers, I sat back in my chair, bruised but unbroken. For the first time in my life, the weight of their power no longer pressed down on me. Instead, it collapsed beneath them. The hearing ended, but the echoes of that day rippled through Charleston like thunder rolling over the harbor. The Crawfords had walked into City Hall untouchable, but they walked out as pariahs. The headlines struck first. Crawford Dynasty in freefall blared across the front page of the Post and Courier. National outlets picked it up within days, broadcasting my father's tirade, my brother's slip of the tongue, and Luis's trembling but resolute testimony. For once, the truth was louder than the lies. Within a week, city contracts were frozen. Equipment sat idle on half-finished projects across Charleston. Workers who had once feared speaking out now lined up outside Marcus's office, eager to share what they had endured. Unpaid wages, unsafe conditions, intimidation. Their stories painted a picture darker than I had imagined, and every detail was another nail in the coffin of Crawford Construction. Victor tried to hold on. He called press conferences insisting the accusations were exaggerated, but fewer and fewer people showed up. Elaine attempted to rally their high society allies, hosting quiet luncheons in manicured gardens, but the invitations were declined. Donors and partners had seen the footage, heard the testimony, and decided association with the Crawfords was poison. Thomas fared worst of all. His outburst at the hearing spread across social media in endless loops, memes mocking his face twisted in rage. The man who once strutted through Charleston like a prince now could barely step outside without hecklers shouting, "She deserved it," back at him in bitter parody. His arrogance had turned into his undoing. For me, the days that followed were a blur of interviews, depositions, and court filings. My body still carried the aches of what they had done, but the weight of public support was something I had never felt before. Letters poured in handwritten notes from strangers who had watched the live stream messages from women who had suffered in silence in their own families. "You gave me courage," one wrote. "If you can stand against them, maybe I can stand against mine." Yet victory carried its own heaviness. Walking the streets of Charleston, I could feel the shift in how people looked at me. Some offered warm smiles, quick words of encouragement. Others looked away as if ashamed they had once whispered doubts about me. The city itself seemed to teeter between relief and shock, adjusting to a future without the Crawfords dominating every decision. Then came the arrests. Federal investigators armed with evidence Marcus had uncovered charged Victor and Thomas with fraud conspiracy and falsifying records. The sight of my father in handcuffs splashed across every television screen felt surreal. For so long he had towered over me untouchable, his voice booming commands I dared not refuse. Seeing him escorted into a courthouse not as a king, but as a criminal, shook something loose inside me. I had not just survived their cruelty. I had witnessed the collapse of the empire they built on fear. Elaine's fall was quieter, but in many ways more devastating. She was not handcuffed like Victor or publicly mocked like Thomas, yet her empire of social standing collapsed overnight. The garden parties and charity luncheons where she once reigned queen dwindled to nothing. Friends who had once clung to her side now crossed the street to avoid the cameras shadowing her every move. In whispered circles, her name became a warning proof that pearls and practiced smiles could not hide cruelty forever. For Crawford Construction, the end came swiftly. With contracts suspended and accounts frozen, creditors lined up at the courthouse. Workers abandoned unfinished sites, cranes stood rusting in the humid air, and lawsuits multiplied by the dozen. Within months, the company declared bankruptcy. The logo that once adorned every billboard in Charleston was stripped down, leaving empty steel frames like gravestones of a fallen dynasty. I should have felt only triumph, but watching the wreckage stirred complicated emotions. This was my family after all. The house I grew up in was put on the market stripped of its heirlooms. The art, the antique furniture, the polished silver, it all went to auction. I remembered being scolded for touching those objects as a child, told they represented our legacy. Now they were scattered across strangers' homes, symbols of pride reduced to commodities. Yet, with the collapse, came a strange kind of freedom. For the first time in years, I could walk through Charleston without my last name hanging around my neck like a chain. Strangers approached me not to demand loyalty to the Crawfords, but to thank me for exposing them. Some clasped my hands and whispered, "You gave this city its voice back." Others asked how I had found the strength. I never had an easy answer, but I knew part of it was standing on that hospital floor, clutching the nurse's note, realizing silence would mean surrender. Personally, the transition was not simple. Nights were restless, haunted by flashes of marble floors and chandeliers of my mother's voice demanding I sign away my inheritance. Healing took time. Therapy sessions became a lifeline, helping me untangle the grief from the fury. Marcus and Janelle remained by my side, more than allies now closer to family than the blood that had betrayed me. Together, we laughed at small victories, shared long silences when the weight felt too heavy, and reminded each other that change was never clean or easy. One evening, months after the trial began, I stood at the Charleston waterfront, watching the sun dip low over the Ashley River. For the first time, the air felt lighter. The Crawfords had been exposed. The dynasty that had ruled my life through fear and violence was gone. What remained was my choice of what to build from the ruins. The empire they tried to use against me had crumbled. But from its ashes, I had something more powerful than wealth or status. I had truth, and truth once set free could never be taken back. Charleston had always been a city that valued history, yet for the first time in decades, it felt like it was writing something new. The Crawfords' downfall left a vacuum, but in that emptiness came voices that had long been silenced. Workers who once swallowed their anger began forming committees to demand better treatment from new contractors. Churches opened their doors for community forums where citizens spoke openly about corruption, intimidation, and family abuse. The city was confronting its shadows, and somehow my name kept surfacing at the center of it. It began with a phone call from the mayor's office. He invited me to attend a council meeting to discuss creating a program for victims of domestic violence, one that would provide both legal and financial support. I hesitated. Standing before politicians was not what I envisioned when I left the Crawfords, but I accepted. That night in a chamber that had once felt hostile, I told my story again. I spoke of the hospital cover-up, the nurse who risked her job to give me the truth, and the crushing fear of facing powerful abusers alone. The room was silent, listening. And when I finished, the council voted unanimously to fund a pilot program they called Natalie's Stand. From there, the momentum spread. Donations poured in from across the state, and soon the program expanded into a full foundation dedicated to helping survivors reclaim their lives. I visited shelters and spoke with women who had fled homes where violence was routine, their eyes wide with disbelief that someone had finally turned private pain into public action. Every handshake, every tearful thank you reminded me that my scars had not been endured in vain. At the same time, my own healing found new direction. Therapy taught me that survival was not the same as freedom, and freedom required building a life beyond revenge. I began lecturing at universities, speaking to students about toxic family dynamics, financial control, and the courage to walk away. My words carried weight not because I was an expert, but because I had lived through the very chains I warned them about. Marcus stood beside me through much of this, his calm presence anchoring me as new responsibilities mounted. Janelle's articles chronicled the transformation of Charleston, her pen as sharp as any sword. Together, we had started something bigger than ourselves. Still late at night, I sometimes walked the quiet streets of the historic district where I grew up. The mansions loomed, their windows glowing softly reminders of a life built on appearances. I no longer felt the pull to belong there. The chains of expectation had broken, and in their place was something far stronger: the conviction that no one, no family, no dynasty should ever hold absolute power over another soul. The story of Charleston spread farther than I ever imagined. What began as a local scandal turned into a national conversation about power family and the hidden scars people carry behind closed doors. Television networks invited me to share my experience, and though my hands still shook when I faced the cameras, I spoke with a clarity I had once thought impossible. Viewers weren't just watching a Crawford scandal. They were watching a woman who had endured the worst her family could inflict and stood taller because of it. Universities began inviting me to keynote events, and advocacy groups reached out eager to partner with Natalie's stand. Soon, the foundation expanded beyond South Carolina, offering grants to survivors in Georgia, North Carolina, and eventually across the Southeast. I traveled constantly, walking into rooms where women and men shared stories that mirrored my own inheritances: stolen reputations, smeared dignity, stripped by those who claimed to love them. Each time I reminded them survival is only the first step. Rebirth comes when you take back the narrative. Yet growth was not only professional. Personally, I was learning to embrace a new identity. For years, I had introduced myself as a Crawford, always followed by the heavy pause that came with the name. Now, when I stood before audiences, I said simply, "My name is Natalie." The applause that followed wasn't for the family legacy, it was for me, for the life I had chosen. Marcus often reminded me that reform without accountability could never last. Together, we lobbied for stricter oversight of corporations receiving public contracts laws that would make it harder for powerful families to bury abuse behind influence. To my astonishment, lawmakers listened. The very state that once bowed to my father's will began drafting bills inspired by my testimony. I knew politics was messy, but every small change felt like reclaiming a piece of the justice my grandmother had believed in when she left me her inheritance. Janelle's reporting, relentless and precise, turned into a book chronicling the fall of the Crawfords and the movement that followed. When she handed me the first copy, she laughed through tears. "You realize, Nat, you've become the story I always dreamed of writing." I smiled, holding the book like a mirror. It was strange seeing my pain printed on glossy pages, but also liberating. The truth was out there, indelible. One evening, standing on a stage in Washington, D.C., before a room filled with survivors, lawmakers, and advocates, I realized I had stepped fully into a new life. The chandeliers overhead no longer reminded me of the night I fell to the marble floor. They reminded me of how far I had risen since. I closed my speech with words that felt truer than anything I had ever said. My family tried to break me for money, but what they gave me instead was purpose. And with that purpose, I will spend the rest of my life breaking chains for others. Looking back, I often ask myself what the true lesson of my story is. Was it about the downfall of a dynasty that believed it could bury the truth? Was it about the cruelty of a family that placed money above blood? Or was it something larger, something that reaches into the heart of anyone who has ever been silenced by those who should have protected them? The truth is, this story is not only mine. It belongs to every person who has been told that keeping quiet was safer than standing tall, to every daughter who was told her voice was less important than the family's reputation, to every son who was warned that questioning authority meant betraying the people who raised him. My father, my mother, my brother. They believed that by breaking my body, they could break my will. But pain is temporary. Silence once shattered cannot be pieced back together by threats. If there is one message I want etched into the memory of everyone who followed my journey, it is this: no amount of wealth, no level of influence, no family name has the right to dictate your worth. You are not defined by the cruelty of others. You are defined by your refusal to accept it as the end of your story. Charleston became my battleground, but it is also where I discovered that communities rise when truth is spoken aloud. When Luis the waiter risked everything to tell what he saw, he reminded us that courage often comes from unexpected places. When the nurse slipped me the original intake note, she proved that integrity survives even in systems pressed down by power. Each act of bravery, no matter how small, became the stepping stones that carried me forward. To my grandmother who believed in me when no one else did, I can only hope I have honored your legacy. You left me $2 million, but what you truly gave me was the spark to fight. And through that fight, I learned that the real inheritance worth holding on to is dignity. So I speak now not just to those who watched my family fall, but to those watching from their own quiet prisons. If you are enduring manipulation, cruelty, or control, remember this. What seems like weakness can become your greatest strength if you refuse to surrender it. You are not alone even when it feels that way. Others have walked this path, and each of us leaves signs for the next traveler to follow. The Crawfords wanted me erased. Instead, they handed me a platform. And with that platform, I now ask you to consider if this were your daughter, your sister, your friend. Would you protect the family's image, or would you protect the truth? When I stood in the ruins of what was once my family's empire, I realized something powerful. Justice is not a single moment. It is a process, often painful, often slow, but always worth the fight. For every courtroom victory, there were sleepless nights filled with doubt. For every headline that celebrated the truth, there were whispers that tried to drag me back into silence. Yet in the end, what mattered was not the Crawfords' fall. What mattered was that people saw what happens when someone refuses to be broken. I am not naive. I know there are still families out there who use fear as their currency, who treat loyalty as chains instead of bonds, who see their children as extensions of their pride instead of human beings with their own destinies. Maybe some of you listening now have lived through it. Maybe some of you are living through it this very moment. If that is you, hear me clearly, you are not defined by their control. The story you write for yourself is stronger than the one they try to force on you. If my journey teaches anything, it is that change begins the moment you decide that silence is no longer acceptable. It does not take millions of dollars or a national spotlight. It takes a decision to say, this is not right, a decision to reach out for help, a decision to believe that your worth cannot be dictated by those who wound you. The Crawfords lost their company, their influence, their reputation, but I did not fight just for that. I fought so the next young woman in a hospital bed staring at bruises she did not deserve will not feel alone. I fought so that a worker underpaid and threatened by a powerful boss will know his story matters. I fought so that this city and perhaps even this country will remember that no family name, no empire, no fortune is above the truth. Now, I ask you, those who have followed my story, what will you do with it? Will you keep it as a piece of entertainment, or will you carry its lesson into your own life? If you see injustice, will you turn away, or will you speak up? If someone you love is suffering in silence, will you protect appearances, or will you protect them? My grandmother's final gift was not $2 million. It was the courage to live free of chains, and that is what I leave with you. Take the courage. Speak the truth. Refuse to bow to fear. If this story moved you, share it. Tell someone else that silence can be broken, that change is possible. And if you believe voices like mine matter, then stand with me, because the more of us who rise, the fewer dynasties of fear will remain. When I first shared my story, I thought it would end the moment the court ruled, the moment my family's company collapsed, or the moment the headlines faded from the news cycle. But what I have learned since is that stories do not truly end when the final chapter closes. They echo, they ripple, they become part of the lives of those who hear them, shaping choices in ways the storyteller may never see. And that is why I am speaking to you now. I know many of you are watching from your living rooms late at night, or sitting at your kitchen table with a cup of coffee, or maybe scrolling through your phone in a quiet moment before sleep. You may be in South Carolina or Texas or Ohio or a small town I have never heard of. But wherever you are, I want you to know something. This story is not just mine. It belongs to you too, because its lesson reaches beyond the Crawfords, beyond Charleston, beyond the bruises in the courtrooms. It touches every place where silence has been mistaken for loyalty, every home where appearances were valued more than love, every family where control was dressed up as care. So I ask you, how many lives remain bound by chains of fear right now in this very moment? How many daughters are told not to embarrass the family? How many sons are told their worth lies only in carrying the name? How many mothers and fathers are crushed beneath the weight of reputations they did not choose? Maybe you know someone living in that shadow. Maybe quietly you are that someone. This is why I cannot let my story rest as a tale of revenge or downfall alone. It must be a spark that lights conversations at dinner tables, that makes someone pause when they hear a neighbor cry out, that gives courage to the person who has hidden bruises for too long. But sparks only matter if they spread, and that is where you come in. If you believe in what happened here, if you believe that truth deserves to be louder than lies, if you believe that no dynasty of fear should go unchallenged, then I ask you to carry this forward. Share it. Talk about it. Write about it. Because when we speak openly about what others want buried, we weaken the walls they hide behind. I cannot reach every living room, every church pew, every community meeting. But you can. You can tell this story not as a scandal, but as a warning, and more importantly, as a call to courage. You can be the one who listens when someone else finally whispers their truth. You can be the one who says, "I believe you." And sometimes those 3 words, spoken at the right moment, can change a life. I want you to pause and think about your own story. Not mine, not Charleston, not the Crawfords, yours. Every person carries moments they wish could be buried and moments they wish could be shouted from rooftops. For some of you, those memories are tied to family. Maybe you grew up with a parent who demanded perfection but offered no love. Maybe you lost an inheritance to siblings who played the system. Maybe you were told your voice did not matter because someone else's pride mattered more. If that stirs something in you, I want you to know you are not alone. When I stood in that ballroom, I thought I was completely isolated, the target of a family that valued reputation above blood. But when the videos spread, when the testimonies came forward, when the letters began arriving at my doorstep, I realized something profound. Pain isolates us, but truth connects us. What one person endures in silence, another has endured too, and another after that. And when we share it, we begin to strip the shame away. That is why I am asking you, not just as a viewer, not just as a bystander, to take responsibility. If you are over 50, you have lived long enough to see how money, pride, and silence can fracture families. You have seen how secrets rot from the inside. You know the cost of pretending everything is fine when it is not, and that wisdom, painful though it may be, can be turned into strength for others. Think about the younger people in your life: a daughter, a grandson, a neighbor's child. What will they learn if they see you accept cruelty in the name of keeping peace? What will they inherit if silence is passed down like a family heirloom? You have the chance right now in this moment to change the legacy, to say that truth, dignity, and courage are worth more than appearances. I am not asking you to fight a courtroom battle like I did. Not everyone will face a dynasty with lawyers and contracts, but every one of us faces moments where we must choose between staying silent or speaking up. When you hear gossip that hides abuse, do you let it pass? When you see someone mistreated, do you look away? When you feel the weight of injustice pressing on your chest, do you breathe it out or let it suffocate you? These questions matter. They matter because each choice builds a pattern. Families are destroyed not just by the greed of one man or the cruelty of one woman, but by the quiet acceptance of everyone around them. Do not be part of that silence. Do not be the one who looks back with regret, wishing you had spoken sooner. Responsibility is not a burden. It is a gift. It means you have the power to shift the story, not just mine, not just yours, but the stories of those still waiting for someone to stand beside them. Communities are built on stories. Some are stories of triumph that we pass down proudly, and some are stories of shame that we bury in silence. But here is the truth. I learned silence does not erase the story, it only gives it more power in the dark. That is why communities like yours and mine must become places where truth is spoken out loud, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it rattles the foundations of what we thought we knew. In Charleston, once the Crawfords fell, people began to speak. Workers who had been threatened suddenly found their voices. Neighbors who once whispered behind curtains stepped forward and admitted what they had seen. That collective courage changed not just my life, but the entire city. And if it can happen in one southern town with deep traditions and even deeper silences, it can happen anywhere. This is where you come in. Communities are not abstract. They are made up of people like you. You are the neighbor who notices when a woman across the street wears long sleeves in summer to cover bruises. You are the church member who hears a prayer request that hints at fear behind closed doors. You are the friend who picks up the phone and hears a tremble in someone's voice. You may think these small moments do not matter, but I promise you they do. They are opportunities to open a door that has been locked too long. I am not asking you to be a savior. I am asking you to be present, to ask, "Are you all right?" and mean it, to say, "I believe you" when someone risks sharing their truth, to stand beside them when they face backlash for daring to speak. That is how communities change, not through grand speeches or sweeping reforms alone, but through ordinary people choosing not to look away. And if you are someone who carries your own hidden scars, I urge you to see your community not as a threat, but as a potential source of strength. I know it is hard. I know trust feels impossible after betrayal. But there are people willing to stand with you. Sometimes it is a nurse slipping you a note. Sometimes it is a journalist who believes your story matters. Sometimes it is a neighbor who refuses to let you carry the weight alone. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether you will let them in. We often think courage looks like courtroom battles or microphones and cameras. But courage can also look like knocking on a neighbor's door, like speaking truth at a family gathering, like refusing to laugh at a cruel joke that normalizes control. These are the bricks that rebuild communities one choice at a time. If you are watching this, you are already part of a community this one. And the question is simple: will you let this story pass as entertainment, or will you let it move you into action where you live? If you have stayed with me until now, it means this story touched something inside you. Maybe it stirred anger. Maybe it stirred sorrow. Maybe it stirred memories you thought you had buried. Whatever it awakened, do not let it slip away when the video ends. This is the moment to make a choice. When my family tried to silence me, I thought I was alone. But when the community rose beside me, I discovered something powerful. Tyranny within families, within companies, within institutions cannot stand when ordinary people decide they will no longer accept it. You may feel small against systems built on money, fear, and reputation. But remember this: systems are nothing without people to uphold them. When people withdraw their silence, the system crumbles. So I ask you directly, what will you do after hearing my story? Will you talk with your children about what real love and respect look like? Will you ask your local schools how they respond to reports of bullying or abuse? Will you check in with that friend you know is struggling but pretends everything is fine? Action does not have to be dramatic to be transformative. It simply has to be consistent. For those of you who have endured your own battles, I say this: your pain is not meaningless. It can become a torch that lights the path for others. When you speak, when you share, when you refuse to carry shame that was never yours, you are breaking the cycle for someone else who does not yet have the strength. That is how legacies are rewritten. Not by those who inflicted harm, but by those who refused to stay silent in its aftermath. And for those who have never lived it, you still have a responsibility. The culture we allow is the culture we create. If you laugh off cruelty, you give it oxygen. If you stay silent when someone is demeaned, you become part of the silence that shields abusers. But if you interrupt, if you name it, if you refuse to participate, you are cutting off the roots that feed the poison. This story is not only about Natalie Crawford. It is about every person who has been told to value reputation over truth money, over dignity, silence over survival. It is about communities that must decide whether they will cover for those in power or stand with those in pain. It is about you, here and now, deciding what kind of world you will help shape with your choices. I cannot make that decision for you. All I can do is hold up a mirror and ask, will you look away, or will you act? Comment below with your thoughts. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so that these truths continue to be spoken loudly and clearly. But beyond the screen, take this energy into your own life. The next step belongs to you.